I'm going to do a quick review of chapter 3, just to kind of get us where we were when we left a couple weeks ago. So just a reminder, we had Ruth in a field with Boaz. Recall that Naomi told Ruth to go sleep at his feet, and then so it was in the evening, and then he wakes up, and then she basically somewhat proposes to him and asks him to redeem her and and marry her. Essentially, that's what happened. But I did fail to detail exactly what that's all about, and I didn't go over that last time we were here. So, if you don't mind, I'll tell you what. Let's just turn to Deuteronomy 25, because this will explain a little bit of what is going on here in Ruth chapter 3. Have you ever heard the term levirate law?
Levirate law?
Yeah, it's spelled Levirate, and it's described in Deuteronomy 25. And it's where God sets up a plan in case what happened to Naomi was to happen, or it happened to others, where your husband dies, and then your sons die, and you have no inheritance. What do you do? And so in verse 5 of chapter 25, I'll tell you what. Let me read this. The Authorized is a little antiquated on this, so let me read it in the ESV. Give me just a minute to get there. Does anybody want to read it?
Sure.
Read verses 5 to 10.
10, okay. Mm-hmm. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall have relations with her and take her to himself as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall then be that the firstborn to whom she gives birth shall assume the name of his father's deceased brother, so that his name will not be wiped out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's widow, then his brother's widow shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's widow shall come up to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his family shall be called by the name, the house of him whose sandal was removed.
Pretty interesting, huh? Imagine
my dirty sandal.
Imagine if there was a law like that in our country, where if you're going right there, I know where you're going, but by the way, this affects the men a little bit more than it does the women in some case, because let's just put it in perspective. So I'm the oldest of all my brothers. I have 5 other brothers, and so I was the first one to marry out of all of our brothers. The brothers would have, if they were under this law, they would have been very interested in who I'm marrying. Because if I die, they got to marry my wife. And they may not like the choice that I made. They may not like Tommy. They probably wouldn't have been they probably wouldn't have liked the fact that I only knew her for 4 months and then married her. Which is probably, I wouldn't advise that. We've been married 35 years. It seems to have worked for us, but I'm not saying that's the way you should do it. But notice also, if I was to die, my brother would have to marry my wife and what? Have a son. And what would the son's name be? Kevin. So that's interesting. And I'm going to come back to that later because there's something interesting about that. So this was God's way to assure that the family name would be carried on. This is his way of doing it. That was important to God. It would also, I think, add that for the woman, I think it adds something, because you better make sure you're marrying into a good family. So I think there's 2 sides to looking at this. So it assures that the family name is carried on. It gives benefit to the woman, that she's going to have security. But there's one other thing. The land that was owned by the husband, that land stays in the family. Okay, so it doesn't get separated. You notice when you read that at the very first part, it said that she was not to marry a stranger. Mm-hmm. And so that meant that she was supposed to marry someone within that was related. At the very least, somebody that was in the tribe. Otherwise, you have property going to somewhere where it shouldn't. And you might recall we talked about this some weeks ago, where the land was divvied up between tribes, and the idea was the land would stay within that tribe. So there's some complicated side to that. So there was the other thing I was thinking yesterday as I was driving back from Virginia. I was thinking about the story, and I do this often, and I hope you guys aren't offended by it, but I often try to think outside what's there. Sometimes something's not written there, but you kind of just, you know how people are, and you know that they probably think certain things or would say certain things. And you remember when Boaz, he wakes up, they have this conversation between him and Ruth, and it must have been very subdued because it seemed like nobody else woke up that was sleeping around the sheaves of barley. And they have this conversation, and then he says, I'm going to redeem you, but there's another redeemer. And he says, just lie down till morning. Remember that? Well, then he tells her the next morning, the Bible says they wake up before any man was up. And it was probably, not quite, the sun probably wasn't quite up yet. They both woke up, and I imagine they both woke up because they both had a lot on their minds. And Boaz just made a major commitment, and Ruth is pretty excited by it, that she's going to have a potential husband. So the last thing he tells her is hold out your garment, and he gives her all this barley and says, take it to your mother-in-law. Remember that? Mm-hmm. So in Ruth 3, has anybody got Ruth 3? Somebody read verses 16 and 17.
When she came to her mother-in-law, she asked, who are you, my daughter? She told her everything that the man had done for her. Then she added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said to me, you shouldn't return to your mother-in-law with nothing.
Okay. So recall now, this is back, she's returning early in the morning too, and you notice that Naomi says, who are you? Because this is early in the morning. She's not expecting someone to be there, and then she realizes it's her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And I think it's interesting that Ruth tells Naomi, hey, Boaz said to bring this back to you. That is said specifically to Naomi. And I may be playing more into this than what I should, but this is just how my mind works. In my mind, this is a subliminal message to Naomi. It's Boaz's way of saying to Naomi, hey, I know what you're doing and I like it. Because how would Ruth know about the Levirate law? She wouldn't. She might have been informed a little bit by Naomi, but Ruth is obeying Naomi, and I'm sure Boaz is very aware of that because he notices that Ruth does everything tit for tat. She's laying at his feet. She says, spread your wings over me. How would she know all that vernacular if Naomi hadn't told her? So when Naomi hears that Boaz has said, bring this back to your mother-in-law, to me, that's a way of Boaz telling Naomi, hey, I've got it. And so you notice the response that Naomi gives Ruth. She says, don't worry about this. Boaz will not rest until this matter is settled. Remember, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. And so she is really emphatic about that. So that's kind of where we pick up today. Recall at the end of the chapter of chapter 3, remember that Boaz tells Ruth, hey, there's another redeemer that's closer to you than me. And I have to go to him first to see if he'll redeem you. So when we left off last week, we were not sure, although we kind of read the end of the book so we know, but we really weren't sure or let's just put it this way, Ruth wasn't sure who she was going to marry. She knew she was going to be marrying somebody, she just didn't know who it was. So in verse 1 of chapter 4, then we have, this is that next morning, Boaz went up to the gate, sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman whom Boaz had spoke to Ruth came, and he said, hey, sit down here, and he turned aside and sat down. Now, I've mentioned to you in recent lessons, we talked about the city gates. You might recall, we talked about this a little bit, but let me remind you, the city gates are really big, somewhere as high as 39 feet. Excuse me, no, the walls are 39 feet. The gates could be as high as 15 to 20 feet. So these are really big gates. But when you went in these gates, there was a big courtyard. And not every city's courtyard was as large as others. It probably had something to do with depending how large the city was. But in this courtyard was a lot of activity. It was bustling with activity. There were vendors set up. You may even recall, later on we'll find, that kings would sit in the courtyard and there would be things brought to him. Of course, he's a politician in a way too, so it's one way of him meeting with the people and getting the approval of the people. And so there was just a lot of transactions that happened in this courtyard. It was a busy place. And of course, add to that, you got all these people coming into the city and people leaving the city. So it's kind of a thoroughfare where there's just a lot of activity and noise and things happening. So that's where we are here in verse 1. So one of the things that's also interesting, Michelle, do you mind reading verse 1 again? Because it reads a little different than mine. Just read verse 1.
4?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Come over here, friend, sit down here." And he came over and sat down.
Okay, so I've noticed that some Bible commentaries, more than one, and I don't know the Hebrew, and I know you use a Hebrew Bible, Patrick, but supposedly in the Hebrew, the word that's used for redeemer or friend there is a word that it's real vague. It's almost like calling the other redeemer Mr. So-and-so.
Yeah, mine says such and such.
Such and such. Yeah, it's a very vague, it's what's the word?
Ambiguous?
Yeah, that's the word. Isn't that the right word to use for that? So it's a way of saying that the writer knows who the other redeemer is, but he doesn't want to mention him by name. And there could be reasons for that. So anyway, he tells him to turn aside, sit down. And so what that tells me also is that Boaz knows this man pretty well. He knows his routine. He knows where he's going to find them, because he goes to the courtyard and he must know that this man comes in and out. I don't know how close he was with this other man, but apparently he knew more about him than what's listed here, or what's written in this passage. So Boaz stops him, and in verse 2, he says, and then he took 10 men of elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Now, in this courtyard, if you look at different pictures of courtyards that were behind the gates of cities, you'll notice there's a lot of different renderings. And archaeological digs have revealed that beyond these gates, each city was unique in its courtyard. Some courtyards had rooms or chambers, places where you could conduct business, where you could go into a separate place where you'd have some privacy, because obviously the courtyard's very busy, it's loud, there's a lot happening, there's animals coming through, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And so sometimes you need a place where you can just get away and transact business. But you'll see later on as we get into this chapter, that doesn't appear what Boaz does here. It appears that Boaz just finds maybe a corner or a place that's kind of out of the way in the courtyard. And I'll show you why I think that later. And so then he grabs 10 elders, 10 important men that can be witnesses to what's going to happen in here in this conversation. And in verse 3 and 4, he says to the Redeemer, this Mr. So-and-so, or Mr. such and such, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, I come after you, and I will redeem it. So are you catching the flow of what's going on here? Mm-hmm. He tells the background story first of Ruth coming with Naomi. I don't know how much details he goes into, and I'm not really sure how much Mr. So-and-so knows about Naomi or Ruth. He would know Naomi because he would know Elimelech, so he would be aware of her. But, we've been to family reunions before where it's almost like meeting people you don't know. I don't know if that ever happened for you, but I've been to family reunions like, oh, you're my cousin? Okay, nice to meet you. Or you're my aunt? There's a lot of people. And remember, in those days, families were big. They were very big. There was no birth control, so you had a lot of people. So he tells the story, and I think there may have been other things that were said that are not recorded in the text. I don't know how much detail he went in. But notice that Boaz focuses on the property. That's what he focuses on. He doesn't focus so much on Ruth. He's focusing on there's a parcel of land that's being sold. He mentions that it belonged to Elimelech. And so this man that came in, Mr. So-and-so, He had just come in that day to do his normal business and the activities that he was planning for. This was hitting him as a surprise. He was not aware that as soon as he walked through the gate, he was going to be stopped and asked to sit down, and all of a sudden there was going to be an opportunity to purchase land, which in those days would have been a big deal. Let me interject something here. Again, this is me kind of playing with something, but I think I'm not going too far in this. If you notice when you read Deuteronomy chapter 25, did you notice that there's someone present? Who is the one that spits on the man because the man did not honor his commitment?
The daughter.
That's right, the widow.
The widow.
That's right. So while it doesn't say it in chapter 4, there's every reason to believe that Ruth would be present during this meeting. Because if the man didn't acknowledge, if it was a situation where it went awry, she would be there to spit on him.
Legalistically, though, does she have any right as she's a foreigner?
That, and there was
It's
no
possible.
brother. There was also no brother.
That's true, which is the only reason why they're going to Boaz to begin with. Yeah, because there is no brother. That's a whole different thing, and we'll get into that in just a little bit too. So I don't know if Ruth and Naomi are there. I've noticed some Bible teachers, some commentaries say that they think she is. It really doesn't change the story one way or the other, but the only reason I mention it is because she may have been wondering about the strategy that Boaz is using. Boaz is not mentioning her. He's only mentioning the property. But I don't know this for certain, but in my mind, I think that Boaz is mentioning the property first for a reason. He knew this man. He knew the individual he was talking to. He knew that the man would be interested in property. He wanted it to be sure that with the 10 elders, that the witnesses that are listening, that he gave this man every opportunity to buy the property. He didn't use anything else. He just said, you can buy the property. There's a strategy behind it. It might seem crazy, and if you're Ruth, you might be wondering about it initially, but we see here that Boaz knows what he's doing. Look at verses 5 and 6. So he says, then Boaz said, the day you buy you buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, well, where am I at? I'm losing my place here. Let me start over. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, it seems obvious to Boaz that he really thought this out on how he was going to approach this to Mr. So-and-so. And the other Redeemer immediately, once he hears the name of Ruth, I'm assuming that's what it is, says, I can't do it. I also wondered, you mentioned, Michelle, that she's a Moabite. I wonder if that also comes into play, because we know about the Moabites. We know their history, and they were cursed. And so maybe he wouldn't be interested in a Moabite. But it's more than likely that the man was already married. He already had a wife. He had sons that were older. It could be complicated. I wonder if Boaz, again, knew enough about this Redeemer to know why he would refuse the transaction, and that's why he approached it this way. But he wanted it to be said in front of witnesses so that there was no question of the fact that he did offer it to him. And also, I think it could be difficult. Let's just say that the other Mr. So-and-so did acquire the land. It could be complicated later when he died, the passing on, because the land did technically belong to Elimelech. It could have just gotten, a probate issue kind of thing in that day. It could have been just something more than he wanted to deal with it.
Especially if Ruth actually had a son with him, then the inheritance could have been split even more.
Well, and that is, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that would have been a requirement, as we saw in Deuteronomy. He would have to have a son with her, and he knew that. So it just wasn't going to work for him. Once there was a mention of Ruth, whatever the issues were, the Bible doesn't tell us that. It was pretty cut and clear that this man was not interested in Ruth. So now it's time to make it official, and then we come to verses 7 through 10. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one drew off his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he takes off his sandal. Then Boaz says to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon, and also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, have I bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native's place. You are witnesses this day. So, if Ruth was present, sure.
Well, I mean, so this would mean Elimelech had no brothers?
Apparently not. Yeah, that's a good point. But
I don't know why that just hit me.
yeah,
But
there's a lot of things that hit me in this story this week, and I'll get into one of them that's kind of complicated here in a minute. But yeah, there's a lot of questions here for sure. Apparently, we just know that we know of the two redeemers that were the most closest to them that would be eligible, and so we just have to make that assumption. Again, going back to if Ruth was there, I don't know if she's there, but if she is, her heart is racing at this point. Because, again, just a few minutes before this, she doesn't know who she's marrying. She either is marrying Mr. So-and-so or she's marrying Boaz. So now she sees the wisdom on how Boaz has approached this, and now the man has said, no, I don't want the property, which in effect means he doesn't want Ruth. So that means that Boaz is going to take advantage of this opportunity, and he's going to be married. She's going to be married. I did some research on this week. As best I can tell, in this situation, unlike where you see in the Old Testament there be long engagements, remember even with we've seen long engagements in the Bible where with being engaged was almost married. You remember the word espoused with Mary and Joseph. It was a long engagement. But it seems as though, from what I can tell, under Levirate law, in this situation, the marriage was imminent. In other words, it could have even been the same day. That as soon as this transaction takes place, that the Redeemer says, I want Ruth. The sandals exchanged. And by the way, there would have been no spitting in a face here because that didn't apply to this situation. You didn't have a man denying that he wanted for other reasons. There was a Redeemer available who wanted her. So it's apparent that Ruth is going to be married and married pretty quickly. Can't ignore the witnesses here. Not just here for the transaction that took place and the proposal that goes to Mr. So-and-so. But you notice throughout the Bible, there's usually witnesses with marriage. And we do that today. The Bible is not a big advocate of common law marriage. It likes witnesses. It's a ceremony. It's a commitment that you're making before God and others. That's why even to this day, if you get married in a courthouse, which I hate to admit, but Tommy and I did, and we would go back and do that differently if we could today. Both of us would, for sure. We had to have a witness. And I bet you anything that the judge that married us in Mobile would have put money on the fact that we wouldn't be married a year from that day. But he'd probably be surprised to know that the thing he signed in his office there, that we're still married. But the point is that God ordains public marriage with witnesses. It's his way of doing things. It submits the commitment between the man and the woman. Obviously today, people don't take that as seriously as they used to, but God wants others that are witnesses to help that couple to keep their commitment. So we see the sandal being given to Boaz, which finalizes the redemption. That means it's a done deal. You might as well say that's the signature, with the sandal being given to Boaz. And I get the impression that as Boaz makes this announcement in verses 11 through 12, where he says, you are the witnesses this day, and I have bought all this, based on what happens next, you get the impression that Boaz is saying this with some elation, some excitement. It's not just an announcement that's legal. He's excited. He's got a wife, and when you look at the words that Boaz has said about Ruth, he calls her a virtuous woman, and it just talks about, he realizes that this is a real catch. She's not just attractive, but she has all the qualities that he sees to be valuable in a woman. And so when he announces this in verse 11 through 12, let me just read that again, verses 11 through 12. He says, then all the people, he says, you are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders says, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Jordan to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. There's a lot in that statement there that's being said. I want to go over a little bit of it. Again, once Boaz makes his announcement, you are witnesses, the crowd responds, the people respond, the elders respond. It's let me look at something real quick here. You notice that it says in verse 11, then all the people. Does yours say that too? Then all the people? Or how does yours say that? This is the reason why I think that this transaction doesn't happen in a chamber or room. Because it seems like at this point you have more people than just the 10 elders.
Got people listening in.
Yeah. It's almost like people knew the story. They knew who Boaz was. And maybe it's, it gets out on Facebook or whatever, on Messenger. Hey, there's a meeting, and people just start coming. And you just see, you get the impression there's a larger crowd. And it appears it's a joyous atmosphere. These people are like, yes, we like this. We hope that you guys are as successful as Leah and Rachel, who had 13 children between the two of them. And so they're proclaiming a blessing on this. The mention of, you see that guy named Perez? That is an interesting name mentioned there. Boy, that's a story. We don't have time to get into that. That story is in Genesis 38. You can read it for yourself. Because, she bears a son, Tamar does, and that's the son's name. And it's interesting who the father is. Well, let me just tell you this. It's enough to tell you this is what happens when goes wrong when Deuteronomy 25 is not obeyed. So what happened was this woman died similarly to Ruth losing her husband. There was a brother that was supposed to marry Tamar that didn't. He was told he had to marry her. He goes into her to consummate the relationship. I'm trying to say this very delicately. In the act of physical relations, he decides that, how can I say this without being graphic? Whew. He doesn't consummate the relationship like he should. And the Bible says it this way, and I'm going to say it how the Bible says it. He spills his seed on the ground. Is that enough? Look at it. I don't know how to say that without getting red-faced. God was very displeased with that and kills the man. Then the father-in-law to her says, well, I have another son that's coming up. When he's of age, he'll marry you. But he becomes of age and he doesn't marry. For whatever reason, he's not given to Tamar. So Tamar does something with her father-in-law. Her father-in-law is coming up to where she is, and she takes off her widow garments and decides to put on the garments of a harlot. And apparently the father-in-law is not a very good godly man because he takes advantage of this and goes into her, and she makes him says, what are you going to give me? And she says, I'll give you a kid, a lamb or a goat. And she says, well, what do you give me in advance before I get that? And he gives her like a bracelet. He gives her a bracelet. Well, after all, they do their thing. Later on, he goes back home and he tells one of his servants, go back up to this place and take this goat to this lady who I promised. Well, when he goes up there, this lady's nowhere to be found because she had taken off her harlot garments and put on her widow garments again, so he can't find her. So the servant comes back and says, I can't find her. Well, eventually what happens is the lady reveals to the father-in-law, hey, is this your signet? Is this your bracelet? And he realizes that he has fathered a child through his own daughter-in-law. Perez is the child. Okay, so that kind of gives you background to this. So it's interesting where you just see things mentioned, but it's in Genesis 38. But that's Genesis 38 is what happens when Levirate law isn't obeyed. All right, so then verses 14 through 15, or 13 through 15. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord." Now notice who they say this to. Naomi. They're not saying this to Ruth. They're saying this to Naomi, the mother-in-law. "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, that his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is more to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." Isn't that interesting that they say this to Naomi, not to Ruth? They're saying that Naomi has gotten a redeemer. So, no doubt this is a glorious moment for Ruth, but it's also a glorious moment for Naomi. And these women that are praising Ruth note and make mention of the love that Ruth has for her mother-in-law. They say that it's even better than 7 sons, which is a big deal in that day. That's a really big statement. So apparently this love between Ruth, we already knew it was really good because, this woman leaves her family in Moab and leaves her gods and comes with her mother-in-law. But still, this love is just demonstrating in it day by day. Other people are watching the love that this daughter-in-law has for her mother-in-law. And it is such a testimony. And they see that it's not just Ruth loving her mother-in-law. They see that the mother-in-law loves Ruth. It's a reciprocal love. It's both of them loving each other just as much as the one loves the other. Then verses 16 through 17. Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. Not the way you're thinking, by the way, that but became her caretaker. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, we'll get to that part at the end in a minute. But, okay, so I admit, when I first read this verse, I got a little confused. Because if you remember when we were reading Deuteronomy 25, who is the son supposed to be named after? Which would have been Ruth's first husband, Mahlon. So he should have been named after him. But he's not. He's named Obed, which has nothing to do with Mahlon or Elimelech. It's a whole different name. So I was honestly very confused by it. I tried my best to find info on that. For whatever reason, nobody wants to touch it. No Bible commentaries even get close to telling me why that is. And so I will be honest and tell you that I don't fully know, but these are kind of my thoughts on it and just thinking this out and kind of hoping the Lord would give me some clarity on it. You notice that it's not Boaz and it's not Ruth that named the child. Who names the child?
Neighbors.
Yeah, the neighbors. They named. And by the way, who's it the neighbors of? It's the neighbors of Naomi that are naming this child. And it's also interesting that if you look at the genealogy, you don't see Mahlon mentioned anywhere, which he typically should be. It's Boaz that's mentioned. Yet he's not in the bloodline. So it's of Mahlon. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of things about this book, and I'll get into one more that's very unique, that maybe is kind of the exception proves the rule kind of thing. Now, let me just talk about the qualifications of a redeemer real quick. And I think this will help explain some of what's going on here.
Hey, Kevin, before you do that real quick, the Hebrew meaning of the name Obed is servant of God or worshiper.
Worshiper, yes.
Oh, okay, you already sorry. So I'm going to Google it.
Yeah, it's and I can understand why they would name him that, but it just went against what Deuteronomy 25 was saying. But there's some other things, too, that are going against that, and I think there's a reason why. So let's talk about the qualifications of a redeemer. First, in order to be a redeemer, we know that there had to be what? Relations. They had to be related. That was important, and there was no deviating from that. What we need to do here at this point is we need to understand the symbolism between Boaz and Jesus. We call Jesus our Redeemer. He redeems us. In order for Jesus to be our Redeemer, he had to be related. So what did Jesus do? He was born of a virgin and made what? Flesh, which makes him related. He's a man as much as a man can be. The Bible says in John 1:14, he made himself flesh, which qualifies him to be a redeemer. The other thing a redeemer must have is the resources and the ability to pay for redemption. Boaz had that. Boaz had the ability and the resources to redeem Ruth. Jesus paid the highest price with his own life to redeem us. The third thing is that a redeemer had to be willing. And we see here in Deuteronomy and in the story I told you of Genesis 38 that sometimes redeemers weren't willing. In the case of Tamar, the redeemer wasn't willing. He didn't want to consummate that with his brother's wife. So a redeemer has to be willing. Boaz was more than willing. And we see that Jesus laid down his own life. He says, I give of my life willingly in John 10:17 through 18. But we can't miss something very important in this story that really stands out. By law, the Redeemer has the right to take Ruth. In other words, Ruth wouldn't even have a choice. It was just the law. That was what would happen. Boaz would take, or the other Mr. So-and-so, would take Ruth. But this story is unique. It's not just unique that we have some exceptions where you see the son not being named after Mahlon. It's different also in the picture of the Redeemer. Because I think God wanted this book to be symbolic of what was going to come several thousand years later through the lineage of David when he was going to set up a salvation plan. Jesus is our Redeemer. But there's one difference between the Redeemer in the Old Testament and the Redeemer in the New. In the Old Testament, the Redeemer could, by rights of law, redeem someone and take that individual as his wife. In the New Testament, it's not that way. We do as Ruth did. Ruth came to the Redeemer and asked, will you redeem me? And that's what we do. Today, our Redeemer, he wants us to come to him, but he will not force himself on us. Forced love is not true love. And so what he does is he says, come to me. And the Bible says, knock. In Revelations, we have an invitation. And so this Redeemer that we serve today wants us to come to him, but he will not force. And in really 2,000 years after the death of Messiah, we are living out this book of Ruth. Just like it happened then, where Ruth comes and asks to be redeemed, we do the same thing. We're asking for redemption. And I trust that all of you in this room have done that. That you have given your life to Christ and you have been redeemed by the Redeemer because he paid a high price. And so when we come to Christ, we're doing the same as Ruth. Spread out your wings over me, is what we're saying. We want the Redeemer to do that. And so then after that, we have a reciprocal love. We're here this morning. The reason we're here this morning, I hope this is the reason why you're here this morning. You're here this morning because you love your Redeemer. And this is a way you demonstrate. You want to worship him. When you sing later, you want to sing to your Redeemer because you're thankful. And we even have a lot of songs that mention the Redeemer and that we've been redeemed. There's actually a song called Redeemed, Redeemed, an old one in the hymns. And it's because when we sing that song, we're sending him a thank you note. Thank you, Father, for redeeming me. I know what you paid. And so it's a beautiful picture. Any other thoughts on this passage? It does bring up a lot of questions.
The only question I have is, was Naomi just too old to fall into that picture?
She already had sons.
She had sons. You notice that she said in Ruth chapter 2, she mentions to her daughter-in-laws,
If I were to.
What are you going to do? You're going to wait on me to have sons? I don't know if she could have. I don't know what age she is at this point. And we got to remember something too. Just like the relationship between Ruth and Boaz, it was typical for those days. Even with Joseph and Mary, we know that there was a big age difference. It wasn't unusual for a teenager to marry an older man. I know today it's not copacetic and you can go to jail for it, but in that day and time, it was different. And I honestly find myself questioning. I actually think God knew what He was doing. When a girl becomes of an age where she can deliver, we know for a fact that young girls, their pregnancy is much healthier. We have women today waiting way too late for pregnancy, and it's causing all kinds of complications. And some would say that it's even leading to other things that kids are dealing with what's the one thing that they're really hammering on, the autism. So I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a truck driver. But I would say that God. Here's the thing. All throughout the Bible, you see that God has a way, and then man has a way. And if we do it God's way, it usually works out better. It just does. And I know that, like, if you take, for instance, looking at my wife's grandmother and my own grandmother, and looking at older generations past, a couple generations from me, it was not unusual even then for young girls to get married, and their marriages were successful. They were long marriages. In my grandparents' case, and my wife's grandparents, we're talking 60 years of marriage. It wasn't unusual. It worked well. I think God's system is actually pretty good. So again, I said all that to say I don't know, but I do think that I don't know how old she was at this point. Could she have had children? I just don't know. I really don't.
Well, I think because Makwan was already married, he was now the carrier of the family name, so it would be his wife who was passed down, which would be